and welcome to tonight's Millennium Stage Culinary demonstration by Chef Cathal Armstrong as part of the Kennedy Centre's festival, Ireland 100, celebrating a century of Irish arts and culture. On behalf of the International Programming Department, we would like to express our thanks to the 160 volunteers who are assisting with the Ireland 100 Festival. There are 40 of them here this evening as a part of an event which is hosted by the Global Friends, a group of volunteers who support the Kennedy Center's international initiatives, including translation projects, tours in foreign languages, and more. Without further ado, please welcome to the stage Chef Armstrong.
Hello, how are we doing? Everybody enjoying the beautiful day today? Okay, so before we start, I was just going to tell you that I'm going to talk a little bit about my cookbook as we go through, and the cookbook is for sale in the back corner throughout the show, and I'll sign it for you later if you dare to do that. Firstly, I'm just going to mention the magnificent Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which is one of my favorite places to visit in Washington. How many of you live in Washington? Show of hands, a good crowd. Okay, great. So that means some of you have been to Restaurant Eve, maybe for dinner on occasion. Thank you. So I came to America in 1990 for a summer job, looking to earn some fast cash. I heard that the streets were paved with gold. And I came to earn some fast cash to try and get out of the restaurant business. It's kind of, we've taken a little bit of a sideways journey to get there, and we're still not out of the restaurant business. But I grew up in Ireland, and I was born in 1969, and I grew up in Dublin, and which is now the capital of the free world, unlike. We're trying to move things to the east a little bit. So I grew up there. I went to a school called St. John's Boys National School, which was just up the road from us. And then after elementary school, my parents decided that I was going to go to this unique school in Dublin called Coláiste Eoin. And Coláiste means college, and Eoin is the Irish for John. Sean is the Irish for Jack, and Owen is John. So Coláiste Eoin is a unique school in Dublin because we learned everything in the Irish language, not in the English language. So in order to prepare for high school in the Irish language, which is a very different, very ancient language, my parents sent me to Coláiste na Rinne in the south of Ireland in County Waterford, which is a boarding school. They call it a boarding school. Realistically, it was more like prison. You know, some of the funny stories about Coláiste Eoin, at 8 o'clock they turned the lights off in the dormitories and you were not permitted to speak anymore. And if you were caught talking in the dormitory, you got sent to the office in the morning, and Micheál O'Donnell, who was the headmaster, gave us 6 of the best on the hands with a blackthorn stick. Donald Trump would have loved him. Anyway, so you know, we were 12 years old at that time, and at the beginning of the school year, you'd see a row of boys outside the office crying because we knew it was about to happen. And by the end of the year, we discovered that the drain pipes on the building were made of cast iron, and if you wrapped your hands around them, you could numb your fingers, and it didn't hurt nearly as much. And we started having a race to see who got sent to the office the most. A case of yellow jaundice, an epidemic of yellow jaundice went through the school, and a lot of the boys disappeared. There were 20 boys in my dormitory, and 7 of them went home with the yellow jaundice. At least that's what they told us. They gave us some inoculation that, and without warning us, the inoculation, whatever it was, made your urine blood red. So all the poor boys went to the bathroom, and a river of red ran out, and you know, the horrifying scenes ensued. So anyway, we went to Coláiste Eoin, and Coláiste Eoin was a very small school. There were only 140 boys in the whole school, My graduating class in high school was 23 kids, and we knew each other like brothers. But it was very much a nationalistic school in the sense that we were only permitted to speak Irish. You were only permitted to play Irish games. We weren't allowed to play rugby or soccer or anything like that. They only let us play hurling and Gaelic football. And some of the boys, one of the boys in my class went on to be a member, he's a member of Parliament in Ireland for Sinn Féin. And the reason I'm telling you that story is just to kind of understand what the Ireland 100 is celebrating. Does anybody know what we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of? The 1916 Rising. So, and just to condense a huge amount of history into a very short period of time, because it's relative to the dish that I'm going to show you how to make tonight. So in the 1600s, the King of England was James I. James I was Catholic. His cousin, William of Orange, was Protestant. Orange usurped the throne from James and chased him to Ireland, where they had a big war on the banks of the River Boyne, and James I was defeated. So William of Orange became the King of England, and he sent a person called Oliver Cromwell to Ireland to enact retribution on the Irish for how they had helped James I in the battle against William of Orange. So for about more or less 400 years after that, Ireland was occupied by England and ruled by the Crown in London. So there were a few instances of uprisings that were really very pathetic. There were a bunch of small bands led by people like Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone and that kind of thing, who tried to lead rebellions against the British, but they were grossly undermanned and underarmed, and none of the revolutions ever really amounted to anything. One of those revolutions happened in 1916 in Dublin on Easter Monday, which was the 25th of April that year. A small band of rebels took over a couple of buildings in Dublin, and they were led by a gentleman called Patrick Pearse, who was an Irish teacher, a poet. He founded a group called Culinary, which their purpose was to reinvigorate the Irish language. And so they took over these buildings, and there was a whole bunch of confusion about the rising and when it was happening. They put a notice in the newspaper on Saturday that it was cancelled, and then they put it back on Sunday that it was going back on again. And they were very, very poorly armed, untrained teachers, poets, visionaries that had this love for Ireland. Even the Irish people themselves, the residents of Dublin, were annoyed with them causing this ruckus in the city. So it was the British at the time had this sense that the Irish were content with the status quo. They were working on introducing the Act of Home Rule, which meant that Ireland could rule itself from home. So they really felt that everything was okay. So they were off at the horse races when this rising started. There was a big tradition of horse racing in Ireland on Easter Monday. So while they're out at the horse races and the main military leaders of the British Army are at war in Europe, because remember it's 1916, we're in the middle of World War I, these boys decided to cause a bit of trouble. The rising lasted really for about 4 days, although it went on for another couple of days after that. And then the British sent their troops in, and they were crushed pretty quickly. Everybody got arrested, and the leaders of the revolution were taken out and they were executed. Anybody that signed the Proclamation of Independence was executed, and a couple of key things were happening in history at that time. As I mentioned, it was the middle of World War I. The telegraph had been developed and the newspaper had been developed. America was allied with the British against the Germans in World War I. So news got out in America what had happened in the rising and how the leaders had been executed, and the Americans weren't really happy about that. So the British decided that year, at Christmas that year, to release a lot of the prisoners and send them home to Ireland as a gesture of goodwill to try and calm down the rising. So one of the gentlemen that they released at that time was a gentleman called Michael Collins, who you may have heard of. Michael Collins was a military leader, and he started the War of Independence, which happened in 1921, and then we had a treaty, and then the treaty was sent to Parliament in Ireland in 1922 to be ratified. It was voted in, but then a civil war ensued. There was a dispute about how the treaty was signed, because the treaty gave Ireland, 26 counties of Ireland, free state status and left 6 of the counties as part of Britain. So that's really what happened in 1916. It's a significant time in the history of human beings, the human race, because these guys were very much influenced by the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and they through their sacrifice got freedom for Ireland, independence for Ireland. So we're kind of celebrating Irish Independence Day 100 years later, and that's what this is. So we celebrate what Ireland is all about, the culture of Ireland, the music, the dance, the land of saints and scholars, as it was called, as it's still called. So, a tiny island. And just to get back to the point of that, about my Coláiste Eoin and my link to it, is that we were very much not in tune with the IRA, because we would never advocate violence, but very much in tune with a free Ireland and an independent Ireland. The culinary history of Ireland is obviously connected to its history in general. For the years of occupation, the Irish were only permitted to eat potatoes by law. So anyone heard of the potato famine? So in 1845, the potato crop caught a disease called blight. The potato crop failed. The Irish weren't allowed to eat anything but potatoes. So a lot of people emigrated or died because of the failure of the crop. So it's very important to understand, when we talk about Irish food and traditional Irish food, that the people at the time it's peasant food. They were only eating very poor, cheap cuts. They didn't eat rack of lamb. They didn't eat corned beef. They were making corned beef, but corned beef was made for export, mostly to the American market. They wouldn't have eaten any of it. So Irish stew, which is what I'm going to demonstrate to you today, true Irish stew, traditional Irish stew, is made with cheap cuts of lamb. Which would have been one of the only things that they may have had access to, like lamb shoulder or lamb, what's called gigot chops, gigot d'agneau, which is the shin bones. And I make mine with shoulder cut, which is one of the cheaper subprimal cuts of lamb. And we add a lot of vegetables to it because the vegetables are cheaper, and that kind of dish goes a much further away. So. Traditional, when you go to an Irish pub and they have Irish stew and it's beef, you now know that that's not Irish stew, okay? Because to be Irish, it has to be lamb, okay? Nowadays, things have changed. We've in 1995, we had a huge growth in our economy in Ireland with the Celtic Tiger, with great thanks to corporations like Apple and Microsoft and IBM and Oracle. A lot of the major American corporations have their headquarters for Europe in Ireland, because you have an English-speaking, highly motivated, hard-working population. And so all of these corporations invested in Ireland, which gave everybody jobs, which made the economy explode. The housing market went crazy. There were 6-month waits for 7 Series BMWs. And with that came this great resurgence in cooking in Ireland and food. A lot of chefs that had emigrated, like myself, returned to Ireland and started introducing some of the techniques that they had learned on the continent or in the United States, but using ingredients that are indigenous to Ireland. And it's important to remember, I talk to people and they say, what, Irish food, what is that? You don't really think of a culinary scene being synonymous with Ireland, but in fact it's an agriculturally wealthy country. We're located at the same parallel as southern parts of Alaska or Newfoundland, but we're affected by the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream comes out from the Gulf of Mexico and crosses the North Atlantic Ocean and keeps the climate moderate temperate. So we grow crops outdoors year round. We have green grass 365 days of the year for the most part. Very rarely do we see snow. So we have green grass year-round. We have cattle grazing. We have sheep grazing year-round. We have crops growing outdoors year-round. Nothing tropical, you know, like tomato is about as tropical as you get in Ireland. But brassicas, cabbages, leeks, Brussels sprouts, all those things do really well in that climate all of the year. In addition to that, it's an island, and islands are surrounded by seas, and the seas in Ireland are rife with magnificent oysters and lobster and great abundance of seafood, which has been introduced into the modern Irish cuisine and cooking. So we've really seen in the last 20 years or so a great growth in what we can now call Irish cuisine. So friends of mine that go to visit Ireland always come back and the first thing they say is, my God, the food was great. I can't believe how awesome the food was. And you're going to find that in pubs all around the country. It's a very, very progressive country. They were one of the first countries in the world to go non-smoking in public places, which was really amazing and cutting edge for a country like Ireland. They very aggressive with sustainable recycling. So you know, it's a green country in more ways than just the 50 shades of green grass that we have. Go visit. The people are truly hospitable, like they say, and there's a great, like I said, a great food scene. You can go to a pub and get amazing food. My wife and I went there on holiday years ago, and we went to stay in this bed and breakfast in Schull in County Cork. And the bed and breakfast had a good name. It was in one of the books that we one of the tour guide books that we picked up, and we went and we stayed there. And the night before, the lady gave us the menu for breakfast. And this long menu with kippered herrings and full Irish breakfast, whatever you wanted, you could pretty much get for breakfast. And we got up the next day, and she had this table decked out. It was like Alice in Wonderland. I mean, she made her own croissant and Danish and cheese and jams and butter and scones and all this stuff. Like, it was a magnificent feast. And you know, everyone that was staying in the house gathered around for breakfast in the morning. And we chatted and we laughed. We had coffee. And then as I was leaving, I pulled out my credit card to pay the 25 Irish pounds is what it was to stay there for 2 people for bed and breakfast. And the woman said, oh no, I'm sorry, I don't take credit cards. And I said, no bother, we'll just go down to the town and we'll get some cash and we'll come back. And she said, don't be ridiculous, just send me a check when you get home. That type of hospitality still exists in Ireland today. You know, and it's one of those rare special things about a country like that. So I really urge you to go visit. It has 8,000 years of history of people living there. Newgrange is an amazing burial site that predates the Great Pyramids of Giza. One of the significant things about Newgrange is when the sun rises in the morning on the winter solstice on the 21st of December. If it's a clear day and you're fortunate enough to be there, they give tickets out by lottery. If you're fortunate enough to be there, the sun shines in through a box over the opening and shines and lights up the burial chamber, only on the winter solstice. And they don't know how 6,000 years ago they were able to figure out the astrology, the astronomy, to be able to line it up with the sun rising on the winter solstice. But stunning, stunning, stunning stuff. All the way through the history of Ireland, into the times of British occupation, when they built Georgian and Victorian castles, beautiful, magnificent structures. The monastic settlements of the 4th and the 5th century. When you go there, don't miss the Museum of History in Dublin that has a great collection of Stone Age jewelry and gold and stuff that they made all from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. Magnificent history of the human race. So I'm going to demonstrate an Irish stew to you, real Irish stew. And this is something that my mother made, and I altered it slightly, which don't tell her because, you know, you dare not alter mother's recipes. But this one I changed very slightly just because as a chef we want to introduce just a couple of the rules of cooking. But anytime I alter something, I want to make sure that it's really true to the nature of what the dish was and what it was intended to be. I mentioned Julia Child. God, I built a terrible thirst telling stories like that. I was working at a restaurant on Capitol Hill called Bistro Bis. I was there for about 4 years. And one day, my boss called me and said, Julia Child is coming in for lunch on Wednesday, you better be ready for her. So, you know, that's a big deal. So I ordered all this special stuff, and I set up a special tasting menu for her, and I had everything ready to go for Wednesday, and unannounced, she walks in on Tuesday. So, you know, I had no option except off the cuff to cook a menu for her. And I found out later that they actually had reservations somewhere else on Wednesday that she insisted on canceling so that she could come back for lunch again with Jacques Pepin the following day. So 2 days in a row, I cooked for Julia Child. And I would just remembered it because we're gonna cook Irish stew, which takes 2 hours. But I do have one that I made earlier, okay? So, okay, so this is the lamb shoulder chop, okay? So it's just, and I actually cut these myself yesterday just using a hacksaw. But I wanted to do this cut for you because you very rarely find lamb gigot chops or lamb neck in a grocery store here, but I have been able to find lamb shoulder chops in a grocery store in this area. So you can get this anywhere. You can also go to Society Fair, which is one of our restaurants in Alexandria, and order it, and we can pretty much do anything you want there. So we're just going to season the lamb with a little bit of salt on both sides. And Mother didn't do this step. She didn't sear the meat. And the traditional thing was you just put all the stuff together in the pot, and you know, you just put a lid on it and boil. You know, what we call the old Irish cooking technique, which is boil the bejesus out of it. So we're not doing that. We're not going to boil the bejesus out of it. We're just applying some of the rules of braising food correctly. And braised food is, you know, we develop all of these really interesting, deep, complex layers of flavor. Don't spill oil on the stage. My goodness, what a disaster that would be. I was doing a demonstration like this at the convention center a couple of years ago, and I had this very powerful electric stove, and I didn't realize how powerful it was, and I poured the oil into the pan, and the whole thing burst into flames in front of me, and like thousands of people sitting watching, and especially the people that are running the convention center staring at me, and a look of panic on their faces. But you know, just while I mention it, I'll tell you what to do if that happens, okay? So let's just say the thing bursts into flames. First rule, don't panic, okay? Second rule, put it out where it is. You don't ever want to move a grease fire, because when you move the grease and you spill it everywhere, now you're making a bigger grease fire everywhere. And then I'm just going to do 3 because this pan is a little smaller than this one. Then the other thing to remember when you have a fire in your kitchen is no oxygen, no fire, right? So just put a lid on it. Turn it off, put a lid on, the fire will go out quickly. Don't ever panic. When you panic, that's when you're going to make a mistake and end up with a big mess. Okay, so we're going to sear the lamb and get a nice brown color on it. What that does is just gives it that nice, deeper, richer flavor, makes it a little bit more interesting. This is a tool that we use in our kitchen. All of our chefs use it. It's just a meat carving fork, and it's very useful because it's quite a precise tool. You know, and I always find we talk about. Did anybody see the movie Star Wars? Okay, so it's not as clumsy or random as a blaster. It's a more precise tool for a more precise time. So it's rather than using tongs, it's just a little bit more precise and more delicate. So it's a good tool to have in your kitchen. This recipe and the real classic Irish stew is onions, potatoes, and thyme. Okay? But I'm just going to add a couple of little things to it just to make it a little bit more complex and a little bit more interesting. I add a little bit of carrot to it because the carrot is pretty, but also carrots are sweet. It just gives a nice little sweetness. Not too much. I've only 2 carrots for the whole recipe. I add a little bit of garlic to it, just because garlic and lamb are a good natural combination. I add a bay leaf, which I have somewhere here, right here. And bay leaf I put in everything. And I grow bay leaf in the garden at Restaurant Eve. And when I was buying the bushes to plant in my garden, they said, now you know that they don't survive in this climate, right? It's a Mediterranean bush. But in fact, I have bushes, bay bushes at the restaurant that are 8 years old. And the reason for that is the climate is changing. Whatever your politics may be, or whether you believe in who caused it or why it's there, the fact of the matter is the climate is changing. And we have a walled garden at the restaurant, which also creates a microclimate in the restaurant. So the soil is a little warmer than it would be if it was out in the open. So the bay bushes struggled in the very cold, harsh winter about 3 years ago, but they're doing just fine. They've come back, and I put bay leaf in pretty much everything. Okay, so we get this nice brown color on the lamb chops on both sides. Can we smell it yet? I can't smell it in the back, but you can probably smell it closer to the front. This is like camping. I'm camping at the Kennedy Center. So once we have a nice brown color on both sides, I'm just going to pull out the lamb chops and transfer them to a plate here so that we can get the next part in. One of the main reasons that I'm transferring it, because you really could, if you, in a lot of braising dishes, you really could just leave them in the pan and add the vegetables. But I just want to draw your attention to this, which is this fat that's in here. And I don't want all that fat to be in the dish because it'll make it greasy on the palate. This dish, unlike a lot of braised dishes that we cook at the restaurant, we're not using any stock in it. We're using water, and water is very thin, so it has a very thin texture. And we always often talk about texture in food, and you want food to have different textures. So one of them is certainly not greasy. So I'm just going to blot out some of this oil out of the pan, so it's not that we don't get that greasy texture. Texture in food is a key thing. Can anybody tell me what the top selling candy bar is in the world? Anybody know? Take a wild guess. Snickers, okay? So Snickers is the #1 selling candy bar because it's not boring. Unlike, what's the other one called? Baby Ruth, is that what it is? Three Musketeers, right? Three Musketeers doesn't do so well because it has a thin, it's got one texture, right? So Snickers, Twix, Kit Kat sell really well because they have texture contrast. And that's really important when we're cooking, that we add texture contrast to our food. We don't want it to be mushy, we don't want monodimensional, and we certainly don't want oily texture in our food, okay? So we'll just add our vegetables in and let them start to sweat a little bit. And then at this stage, I'm just going to put the lamb chops back on top. Such a simple dish. And then we'll add our water. Of course, the recipe for this is in my cookbook, along with lots of other stuff. I tell you how to make an Irish breakfast from start to finish, how to make your own sausages, black pudding, white pudding, if you're interested in getting that complicated. But I also tell you where to buy sausages and black pudding and white pudding if you don't want to work that hard. Okay, so we'll just adjust the seasoning a little bit, just add a little salt in there and maybe a little touch of pepper. And then we're going to cover it and let it simmer for about 1.5 hours to 2 hours until it's fork tender. Okay, here's one I made earlier. Now, what's happened here during the cooking process is the potatoes start to break down a little bit and they start to add texture to the sauce. So we get this little thickening quality from the potatoes, which, you know, potatoes don't take little potatoes like this don't take 2 hours to cook, but you can see that it's just kind of thickened the stock a little bit, and we're pretty much ready to serve it. Okay. One last step, and this is an important thing when you're cooking. We work a lot with fresh herbs. One of the main things I do in the garden at the restaurant is grow fresh herbs because they add so much to food. So even if you have like a window, you can plant basil or a thyme or rosemary plant out there in your window box and pick it fresh and add it to your food, because it really has, herbs have delicate oils in the leaves. The thyme plant has 18 compounds in the leaf, some of which we haven't identified yet. They have medicinal qualities, but the more you cook it, the more you kill it. And the longer it's off the plant, the less flavor it has. You know, so we want to get it into the food at its freshest part, when it's got the brightest, fullest flavor. Okay, so we're just going to add the thyme, and I just have a couple of tablespoons of chopped thyme that I'm going to add in here at the last second. And sadly, because we're in a place where great art is performed, you can't taste it. You're just going to have to use your imagination or buy my cookbook. Buy 3, buy 1 for everybody. Or I'm going to ask maybe one of the volunteers to come taste it. Maybe one of the gentlemen from the stage, you want to taste it? Mr. Thrasher? Oh, yeah. Come on. This is my business partner, Todd Thrasher. He is our sommelier, our cocktail expert, and so your role is to help them imagine how delicious it is.
Yes, chef. Delicious.
Yeah, so like it's very lammy and gamey. Yeah. And see how, like, I want you to see how, and this only cooked for about an hour, for 2 hours exactly, and you can see how tender that lamb is, like it's falling apart, which is really what we're looking for. And one thing about braising food, stew making, is, I made this yesterday, okay? So when we braise food, when we braise short ribs, or you make beef stew or whatever it may be, when you braise it, you're applying pressure. Pressure causes the texture, the sinews in the meat to move and twist, and what that does is forces all of the liquid that's in the meat, all of the natural juices that are in the meat, out into its surrounding juices, okay? And the meat retracts, and then as when you finish cooking it and you turn it off and you let it cool down, the meat relaxes and it absorbs all of that juices back into itself. So it's very, very, very important when you're braising a dish of any kind, and that's what stew is, that's what braised short ribs are. It's very important that you let it cool down all the way in its liquid before you serve it. So the ideal way to make stew is make it the day before and serve it the next day. It's a great thing for families because you kind of have to make it ahead of time, and you know you can do all your preparation ahead of time. So Irish stew is classically served with this condiment called Piccalilli. And Piccalilli is, curiously, the recipe for Piccalilli is in my cookbook. Nudge, nudge. I think we have a theme here. And so Piccalilli is this Indian pickle originally that was brought back from India by the British discoverers and travelers over there. It has a lot of turmeric in it, it has a lot of vinegar in it, it has a little bit of mustard in it, and it really adds this complex, interesting contrast to the richness of the stew. It's great with shepherd's pie. It's great with any kind of braised dish that you have. So we serve a good amount of the Piccalilli on the side. And just to kind of give you an idea of what you want a dish to look like when it's presented, you know, we just make sure that we get a little bit of everything on there. It's good luck if you get the bay leaf. You're not supposed to eat it. We've had people at Restaurant Eve. We did this great dish at Restaurant Eve. At one point, a farmer called me and said, "I have goose eggs. Do you want some goose eggs?" I said, "Yeah, great, good idea. Let's have some goose eggs." So I made this delicious goose egg custard, and we served it back in the shell, And, you know, we baked it in the shell, and it was so delicious and eggy and custardy. And some knucklehead picked up the shell and started eating it. We made this pedestal out of sea salt for the shell to sit on. And you add water to it, and you bake it in the oven, and it gets hard, and you have this great pedestal, and we sit the egg in it. And some other knucklehead decided to eat the salt. So we serve bay leaves, but we don't want to eat them. And then just a little piccalilli on the side, okay? Several pints of Guinness. That's a real traditional Irish stew. That's really what you're looking for when you go to Ireland and they have Irish stew. This is what you're going to get. You're not going to get some brown Dinty Moore out of a can beef thing, because that's nothing to do with Irish stew. Okay. Questions, comments, funny sayings? Yes, sir. Where's the camera? Here we are. Can we see it? Are we on the camera? No? How about now? Yes, there we go. Yeah, we have a mic we can pass around for questions. Yes, madam. Piccalilli, in the book I tell you how to can it, and you can preserve it for months. You can buy it if you don't want to, but you know, like we as chefs we often get requests from magazines and stuff to give them recipes, and then they send back this reply to us that dish is too chefy or it's too complicated. Well, then why are you asking a chef? Ask a home cook if you want a home cook recipe. Ask a chef for a chef recipe, because that's what we do. So you know, there's a recipe in my book for pork belly. And the recipe has, when you open the page and you look at it, you're going to go, oh my God, this is so daunting, and it takes 3 days to make it, and it's so complicated. When in fact it doesn't take 3 days to make it. It takes about 10 minutes to make a brine solution, which is just salt and water with a couple of spices added to it. And then you leave it sitting in that for 3 days. So it actually doesn't take 3 days. You just have to wait 3 days until it's ready. At that point, you have bacon ready to go. That's bacon. You can smoke it, you can bake it, you can roast it, you can slice it and fry it, you can braise it to get a nice braised pork belly dish. So, you know, we really have to embrace the culture and the love of cooking again. And a lot of us, because we're working all the time, don't necessarily have time to do it maybe every day of the week, maybe every weekend, but certainly we can designate a weekend to it once a month, or you know, get back into cooking. I have recipes in there for demi-glace. Demi-glace is one of the keys to great food.
Okay.
Like,
I have a question.
you ever cooked a steak before? Sir, you ever grilled a steak? You make a good steak at home?
Can I ask you a question?
Most guys make a good steak at home, you know, and but when you make demi-glace and you add that to it, and you add the extracted beef flavor to it, you really kick it up a notch, to use a commonly used phrase in cooking. So demi-glace is the same thing. It takes 16 hours for it to be ready, but it's really only about 10 minutes of work.
Hi, can I ask you a question on your Piccalilli?
Yeah.
It makes 5 pints, but I was looking at the recipe, and it seemed like it would be easy to divide it in fourths. It would make any difference at all?
No, the reason I suggest that you make 5 pints of it is that you can can it and store it, and the flavor develops. You know, it gets better and better and better with a little bit of age.
And if you don't want to can it, can you keep it in the refrigerator, and how long?
Absolutely. In the refrigerator, it's good for about a month. There's a lot of acidity in it, so it'll be fine for about a month.
Thank you.
If it smells bad, don't eat it, for God's sake.
Any other questions?
Hello, Cathal. My name is Fiona from Dublin as well.
Hi, Fiona. How are you?
I have your cookbook. It's
Nice.
out of my kitchen counter. But two of the recipes I really love to cook are your raspberry jam and your scones. And I love to do it especially when I'm feeling homesick.
Nice.
So what dishes do you like to cook when you're home?
Oof. You know, I have been asked many times what my favorite recipe in the book is. And it's hard to put a finger on it, because the book is very personal, and I didn't really set out to write a personal book. I set out to write a recipe book, a cookbook. But every dish that's in there has a story that is personal to me. There's a section of dishes that my mother cooked. There's a section on dishes, things that came from my father's garden. My father was in the travel business, so there are recipes from Spain and there are recipes from France because they are personal things that affected my culinary journey. Probably my favorite thing out of it today is the shepherd's pie. And shepherd's pie, again, is one of those things that I think changed so much over the years. It has become, in general, it's kind of considered to be ground beef. But I don't know any shepherds that herd beef. So that didn't make any sense to me. So I use lamb in it. It's hard to say. Thank you, though. Up the Dubs. Come on, the Dubs. Someone said, come on, the Rebels, earlier. Yeah, Maeve over here said, come on, the Rebels, to me earlier.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. How old were you when your mother taught you how to cook?
So I had a strange childhood in Ireland, needless to say. One of the things I mentioned was the boarding school. How old are you?
I'm 8 years old.
8 years old. When I was 7 years old, my mother sent me on an aeroplane by myself to France to learn how to speak French from a French family. 7 years old. Could you imagine? Could you imagine sending a 7-year-old child on an airplane by themselves? What torture. My parents always cooked. When we were children, food was what we lived for. I have 5 brothers and sisters, and we had to be at dinner every day, and there were no choices, and you had to finish your dinner. You were not allowed to leave the table until your plate was clean. So we started at a very young age being introduced to food. And then my father, when I was about your age, my dad made us work in his garden. And we lived in a suburb in Dublin where there were a lot of houses around. And he would have a big pile of horse manure delivered to the house twice a year. And we had to shovel it into the garden. It was horrible.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm also from Dublin. My mum, when she made this, she used to make it with a pressure cooker. Can we still do that for those of us who don't have the 2 hours to let it sit and want it faster?
Yeah, absolutely. A pressure cooker seals in all the liquid and increases the cooking speed of your dish. It counteracts the natural thing that's happening in the cooking with forcing the liquid out. It's because of the pressure, you're forcing the liquid back into the meat. So you can get a juicier quality product. We're seeing pressure cooking happening in professional kitchens more and more. I don't have one, and my mother had one. She used it for cooking beets because she liked to pickle beets and didn't want to wait that long either. But it does speed up the process for sure. Yeah.
I like lamb very much. But what I don't like is the fat in it.
Yeah.
Do you cut it before you cook it, or I didn't see you cutting the fat?
Yeah. So when I cleaned the lamb yesterday and was preparing the lamb chops and I was cutting them, I trimmed away a lot of the fat because you don't want a lot of animal fat in your food, but we do need some animal fat in our diet. So trim away as much as you like to keep it lean. You see the lamb chops are not particularly, the lamb shoulder is not particularly fatty, and especially because the lamb that I buy comes from a small local organic farm, it doesn't have a lot of fat in the muscle. That's not a natural occurrence in mammals. So when we see a fatty steak, that's not natural. That's something that's been done with selective breeding and genetic altering. All mammals, their muscle tissue is surrounded by fat, not intramuscular fat. So good organic meat shouldn't have a lot of fat in it, and then trim away anything around the edge of the muscle that you don't want to include. Be careful with what you see on CNN or anywhere else, because as an example, for 30 years or so, the Food and Drug Administration has been telling us that cholesterol in food causes heart disease. right? This year, the FDA released a new report, and in there it says there is no relation between dietary cholesterol and heart disease. The fact is they don't really know. It's evidentiary science. We see evidence that suggests that something may be the case, therefore that's what we believe. But the science changes. Evidentiary science changes so much all the time because we're only going on the evidence that we have available to us. So we need some salt, we need some fat, we need some sugar, we need some protein, we need some carbohydrates, some in our diet, a balanced diet. A little bit of fat won't do any harm. Too much, not good. But the main thing to stay away from in your diet, if you're really concerned about diet, is sugar. Yeah, sugar, too much sugar in the diet is what the issue is with people having health problems nowadays. It's not fat.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry. Can I use a lamb shank instead of shoulder?
Yeah, so the lamb shank is this part of the animal, the lower part of the leg. And that is very typically used, and in French cooking it's called a gigot d'agneau. In Ireland we call it jigget chops. If you're using the lamb shank, what I recommend you do is ask your butcher to slice it straight across in about this thick, so you can get that nice sear on both sides of the gigot. But that meat is ideal for it. That any tough meat like that is really good for it. And how understanding of where the flavor comes from in meat and animals, we use the turkey as an example. You have dark meat that's tough, and you have breast meat that's tender, right? Okay, and the reason that happens is the turkey runs around on its legs. The breast doesn't do anything, right? So you have blood flow going through the leg muscles and less blood flow going through the breast tissue. And so the movement of these muscles makes the meat tough but more flavorful. The less movement makes the meat tender but less flavorful. The same applies to pretty much all animals. Like the filet mignon is tender because that muscle doesn't do anything, but it doesn't have any flavor. The ribeye is flavorful but tougher because it works more. Okay, so you have to get that balance between flavor and texture and understanding how the meat works. So the muscles that work hard on an animal are best braised. So anything like shoulder, legs are the good ones to braise. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. If anyone wants to buy a book or get a book signed, I'll be happy to do that in a minute or so.
Thank you all for joining us. Now, you should go out to the outdoor space on the North Plaza to enjoy some fish and chips and Guinness beer, and beers being served outdoors, and there's also a performance outside. And come back on the 29th of May. We are celebrating JFK's birthday. It's the centennial launch of the centennial celebration. Thank you. Good night.